Now, just a little warning before we begin, there will be major spoilers in this video for the 7th episode of Andor, so if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Okay, so I think anyone who hasn't really enjoyed this series so far, who has thought it is too slow and not very Star Wars-like, well, they're almost certainly going to feel that way about this episode. I have little doubt there will be those who say this was boring, or they fell asleep watching it, or whatever else the case might be. And yes, in terms of action, it is a slow episode. There's virtually none of it here. I do understand why some people are simply not enjoying this series, and that's absolutely fine if you're not. We don't all have to agree all the time or love the very same things. That said, I once again really enjoyed this episode. I enjoyed how this acted as a sort of epilogue to the previous story arc, while also acting, you could say, as a sort of prologue for the next one. This was, as Tony Gilroy, the showrunner, said it would be, this was more of a one-off kind of interlude episode. And so it simultaneously cleared the board from the previous part of the story. It showed us kind of the ramifications or consequences in regards to what happened on Aldhani with the heist and the stealing of some 80 million credits, while then also setting the board for what comes next, setting up the next story arc, which Gilroy also told us would be 3 episodes before a final 2-episode story arc to conclude the season. And once again, I think the name of this episode was very fitting, that being Announcement, because it was both the fledgling rebellion with, again, their success on Aldhani, announcing their arrival, if you will, announcing themselves to the Empire, like, hey, we're here, we're going to be a big thorn in your side, while also being the Empire announcing the response to that things in the galaxy are about to get a whole lot worse. Also, before really diving into the episode, I have to say that the music choice or the score was a very interesting and unique choice, and I don't mean that in a bad way. It oftentimes had almost this kind of dystopian vibe to it. It felt like old sci-fi movies from decades past, the ones that kind of came out before Star Wars came out, back when most of them, if not almost all sci-fi, kind of dealt with dystopian futures and had this very similar style of music that relied heavily on synthesizers and this kind of feeling of dread and oppression, this kind of ominous feeling that it would give you. And it was, of course, Star Wars that really broke this trend, the first Star Wars movie, or A New Hope if you prefer, that not only made something uplifting and fun in the sci-fi genre, something that harkened back to Lucas's childhood and the serials he watched like Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers, but had an uplifting soundtrack to match, a kind of grandiose soundtrack, you could certainly say, brought to us by the master John Williams, who deserves a tremendous amount of credit for the success of that first Star Wars film. But anyway, setting that discussion aside, the episode opens with Cyril kind of sitting alone in his bedroom, contemplating life. He's had to come home, he's being criticized by his mother, and I think this is something a lot of young men and women can relate to, that you kind of strike out on your own, something goes wrong, and you end up back home. We then learn he's going for a job interview set up by this Uncle Harlow, who I don't think we're really probably going to learn too much about. I don't think he's going to end up being some kind of big reveal like, oh, look who Uncle Harlow is. I think it's just kind of implying that this family has someone who is well connected and can get Cyril a job. Either way, we have his mother critiquing the way he looks, that his collar is too high and what that says about him, and I love the sarcasm out of Cyril when he asks, what does my collar say about me, essentially. It's an interesting opening to this episode, I think. Again, I think Cyril is going to be a big player going forward, chasing Andor. A lot of people I see think he's going Rebellion eventually. I think he's hardcore Empire through and through, and he will eventually catch up with Andor. I think he's going to work with Deidre. I don't know. I don't see Rebellion out of this guy. Maybe long-term, end of the line. But right now, this guy is going to be a true hardcore Imperial. Next up, we're taken to the ISB, where we see Yularen, which was cool. He is, of course, from Clone Wars. He also shows up in Episode 4. He has no real speaking lines there. He's been in Rebels. He's been in the EU. He's been in a lot of places. So, kind of a cool moment to see him. Not really fan service, because it makes sense that the head of the ISB would essentially be lecturing the ISB about their failures. Anyway, from him, we kind of learned what the response is going to be from the Empire, that any world that harbors partisan activity is going to have to pay tribute 5 times what was stolen, which is 80 million credits, so 400 million credits. That's nothing to sneeze at, obviously. We also learned that the use of any custom or festival or tradition to cover rebel activity will trigger permanent revocation of Imperial tolerance, which basically means you're going to get your planet taken over if what happens on Aldhani happens anywhere else. And we're really seeing how Aldhani is being blamed for really what wasn't their fault. We also learned that Palpatine is giving them more power, essentially, that they shouldn't have any trouble accessing any army or naval resources, that the ISB is basically going to be the right hand of the Emperor himself to go and deal with the rebellion. There's also this bill that's been introduced in the Senate, and that's going to pass, that will take away more freedoms of the people of the Republic in favor of more surveillance, search, and seizure, which we kind of see the result of that later on. Basically, we're seeing the Empire become even more authoritarian. We're hearing Yularen talking about the only thing they need to decide is how tightly to close their fist, and this is why they work so hard when we are at peace, so that they can keep the peace. It's kind of ironic. It's meant to be ironic that peacetime is all about preparing for war or the next conflict instead of just enjoying the peace. Really here we're just kind of seeing behind the curtain. We are seeing the mindset of the Empire. We are seeing their justifications for taking away the freedoms, that they believe what they are doing, or at least I'm assuming most of them believe what they're doing is right, that people would rather have security over freedom. Now, certainly that is not the case. Most people would prefer freedom with risk over security with minimal risk. And really, it's an interesting scene because it shows how the Empire has first created the rebellion by taking away so many freedoms, and how they will just encourage it to grow by taking away even more. The tighter you close your fist, as Leia once said, the more systems will slip through your fingers. And that's basically what is going to happen. The tighter you try to hold on to something, the more you're going to lose control of it. That scene then pairs very nicely with our next scene, which is Luthen at first listening to some sort of broadcast where we hear 80 million credits were stolen, that all personnel at the garrison were replaced, and I'm talking about Aldhani here, and they are being interrogated by the ISB, that there was a tracking device on the escape craft, but it was disabled before they went to hyperspace. In other words, they can't track the terrorists, as they call them, and that 134 Aldhani residents were taken into custody. I'm assuming pretty much everybody who was at the Festival of the Eye, and that they are being charged with abetting the terrorists. We then have Mon Mothma show up, and Luthen kind of says, without warning, in this almost joking or jovial fashion, because he fully expected her to show up, which is why Clea tells him to wipe that smile off his face, because he knew she was going to show up after what happened on Aldhani, and yet they didn't have a plan to meet. Mon Mothma is kind of using the excuse or the cover for the driver, who is an ISB plant, that they are returning the gift, and, she just wanted to drop by on her way to the Senate. And so we have this really interesting conversation between the two, where at first they try to be all fun and friendly to fool the driver who sits outside, but it's really actually a very deep conversation, of course. We have Mon Mothma basically asking or accusing Luthen of doing this on Aldhani, and does he understand the repercussions or the consequences? And of course he does. The whole reason he did this was to kind of poke the beehive, right? He wants the Empire to take those drastic measures that we talked about in the previous scene. He wants them to tighten the grip because he knows the more they tighten the grip, the more the rebellion will grow. We then have Mon Mothma arguing, do you know how much suffering you're going to bring by doing this? That you've now given the Emperor, you've given Palpatine the excuse to basically do whatever he wants to counteract, as we were just talking about. And Luthen says, good, that's exactly what we need. We need the fear, we need them to overreact. The Empire has been choking us so slowly we've started not to notice. Basically, he's using the old frog in a pot of boiling water analogy here, that if you put a frog in a pot of water and boil it slowly, he's not going to jump out, he's just going to die in there. But if you put him in the boiling water directly, he's jumping out and he's going to fight for his life. He's saying that people have had their freedoms taken away so slowly that they haven't noticed how many they've lost. But now that they're going to have the rest of them taken away pretty much all in one fell swoop, they are definitely going to notice. They're definitely going to want to stand up and fight, or a lot of people are. Certainly many will bend the knee, if you will, and just accept it. Again, it's all about freedom versus security, and we have this great line to kind of cap off the scene where Luthen says to Mon Mothma, if you're not willing to risk your conscience, then surrender and be done with it. He's basically telling her, if you're not willing to risk getting your hands dirty and feeling bad about losing some lives, then this is not the fight for you. Then you have to give up, because the rebellion is going to require sacrifice. We're then taken to the Bureau of Standards, where Cyril is having a job interview in this endless sea of cubicles, essentially, at the ultimate, what I'm going to assume, boring, monotonous job in the Star Wars galaxy is. At one point then, what happened on Ferrix is brought up, that Cyril was trying to, from his point of view, and I think he's right, he was trying to expose corruption, he was trying to find a murderer, he was trying to do the right thing, and it all sort of blew up in his face. And all the interviewer says to that is, we can edit your resume a bit, and basically we can overlook that, because whoever this Uncle Harlow is, he clearly has quite a bit of pull. He can clearly get him this job at the Bureau of Standards for whatever that is worth. We then have this brief scene with Clea, and that's, of course, Luthen's assistant, and she's at some sort of spaceport, I think, and she finds a symbol on the ground that will point her in the direction of Vel, and they have a brief meeting, which we'll talk about in a second. But first, we have this scene where we meet Attendant Falzonis when he's sleeping on the job when Deidre walks in, and he doesn't know how to address her, to call her ma'am or sir, implying that there are not a lot of women in the higher up ranks of the Empire, of course. And all she wants from him is to search every record for the past 2 years across all systems for any kind of navigational ship parts that have been stolen. She's continually trying to put together the pieces of the rebellion puzzle, trying to figure out how they are operating. That's then followed up by another really quick scene of Cinta still on Aldhani. She has this junky old speeder as a Star Destroyer flies overhead. We don't know why she's still there, but we do learn soon enough that there is a reason, that she has another mission of some kind to perform there. Which takes us back to the meeting between Clea and Vel, who is now kind of all dressed up now. She looks rather fancy, if you will, instead of the ragtag rebel she was just days ago. She seems rather disappointed that Luthen himself didn't show up, and there's a mention of some kind of message he sent her, and Clea responds that she did read it. Really getting the vibe here of a father-daughter relationship that has been strained, and my best guess is something has happened to their mother, which is the reason why both of them have kind of joined the rebellion or joined the cause to fight against the Empire. There's probably something that's happened to their mother that have brought them both into the rebellion, but at the same time has split them apart. Vel then asks about Cinta, and as mentioned a moment ago, she learns that Cinta is still doing a job. She is doing what she was told on Aldhani still. Vel kind of brings up all the people that were lost on the mission, and Clea only says they'll be remembered in kind of this cold and callous voice, as if she really doesn't care. One thing I really kind of enjoyed about this scene, though, is the mentioning of receiving messages is just as dangerous as sending them. To me, this kind of goes back to the Phantom Menace. People always wondered, how did Darth Maul track them back to Tatooine? They only received the message, they never responded. Well, this kind of answers that question, I suppose. We also learn that Vel has now been sent after Cassian to essentially eliminate him because they can't have somebody walking around with Luthen in his head. Back to Aldhani we go then, and we see Cinta just riding on this speeder down the side of a mountain. No idea where she's going, what she's going to do, but certainly it'll have something with causing more chaos for the Empire, I think. Next, we finally catch up with Cassian in this episode. We see he's back on Ferrix. He's gone home to talk to his mom. He makes this interesting comment about, since when do you lock the door? Implying this was once a very safe kind of neighborhood or community, whatever you want to call it. He learns that Tim is the one who turned him in and that the Corpos killed him. He also tells Madra, or his mother, that they're going to be leaving, that he has scored, that he got a big payday, and that they can now go wherever they want. And what I like about this scene is you can really tell how much Cassian cares about his mother, his adoptive mother, if you will. It's not his, biological mother, but you can tell how much he cares for her. That seems to be one of the only people he actually really and truly cares about. The only one that he doesn't want to screw over or hasn't screwed over, as far as we know. Anyway, Madra is showing some reluctance to going that Cassian is kind of missing out on. She says, she's kind of old. Maybe now is not the best time. So Cassian says, we'll leave in the morning, and he decides to go check on Bix. Before that, though, we're taken back to Coruscant, where Mon Mothma is having this party, and she is talking to an old childhood friend from Chandrila, Tay Kolma, who has an entire bank named after his family. So clearly this guy is a pretty big deal. And I did enjoy the fact that there were at least some aliens at this party. I know one of the biggest gripes about the show so far is not enough aliens. It's a gripe I certainly agree with. I'd rather have some character aliens, some, interactive, let's talk to these aliens, but at least they're in the background, I suppose. Either way, Tay and Mon Mothma start talking, and Tay kind of gets the hint that she's going to want something from him, but she kind of cautions him that, hey, I've done more than grow weary of the Empire. I'm afraid you'll find my politics a bit strong for your taste, is what she says, or what he says, excuse me. He's basically saying that he knows that she's really not the type to get her hands dirty, that, as she herself says, she's a polite, sometimes indecisive senator who spends her days fighting and failing to protect separatist do-gooders and battling imperial overreach, and she's nothing more than an irritation. But she tells him that's something she learned from Palpatine himself, to show them the stone in your hand so that they miss the knife at your throat. Basically, show yourself as a nuisance, again, but not a legitimate threat, and they're, for the most part, going to leave you alone. That's been Mon Mothma's approach, and the fact that her friend is fully believing it shows that it's been working quite well. Mon Mothma then talks about this charitable outreach program she wants to use as a front because she wants to get access to her family's fortune and she needs the help of this banker, obviously, to do that. And when the banker starts to ask, well, what are we actually talking about here? She says, you're better off not knowing because that's plausible deniability. If something goes wrong and he gets questioned, not that I think he's going to get out of it either way, but at least he has the shot of not knowing exactly what she's up to. And she then kind of turns the tables on him at the end and says the same thing that he said to her about, perhaps you find my politics a bit strong for your taste. And it's a great scene because it kind of just flips the thing entirely on its head. At first, this guy thinks that he's kind of the one who's been out there, kind of in his own way, battling the Empire. Now, not directly, or that's going to get him into trouble, but he sees her as this tame version who's doing really nothing about it. And turns out he's kind of the tame guy doing nothing about it, and she's actually out there doing something. The scene then ends with Perrin, her husband, kind of interrupting the conversation, and, she tells Tay that he is not to be trusted, that her husband is not to be trusted. And I'm curious if her husband is completely clueless at this point, if he just thinks, well, she's talking to this old friend, potentially an old boyfriend, and that's why he's kind of worried about them talking. Or does he suspect something more? Is he not kind of fooled by the rock in the hand of Mon Mothma? Does he see the knife at the throat of the Empire? Or is he completely clueless? I'm really curious to see how this kind of unfolds between these two and what that will mean for their daughter as well. We then go back to Ferrix and Cassian meets up with Bix. He finds out that she's kind of been beat up a little bit by the Empire. And what I really enjoyed about this scene is that Cassian doesn't seem to be aware of the fact that everything is his fault. He seems to kind of place the blame on Tim. If Tim hadn't said anything, everything would have been fine. He doesn't realize that he did kill 2 corpos. He came back to Ferrix. He put everybody here in jeopardy. It kind of shows just how selfish Andor really is, or how he doesn't see beyond the self just yet. Cassian is then heading back home or to his mom's house when he sees a couple stormtroopers and ends up hiding. This kind of triggers a flashback where there are clone troopers marching through the streets of Ferrix, probably, I'm going to guess, at the end of the Clone Wars or right after that when kind of the veil has fallen and the Empire has been formed. Either way, there are some protesters who start throwing rocks at the clone troopers. Cassian is there with his kind of adoptive father. I'm going to assume he's there with Clem. Clem tries to stop these guys from throwing rocks, saying, hey, let's keep the peace sort of thing. The clone troopers turn around to see him with the protesters. It all gets mixed up and they all get executed. We learn that Clem is hung in the town square, essentially. Cassian then gets back home and he wants Madra, his mother, to come with him, but she wants to stay and kind of support the rebellion any way she can. She feels she's kind of too old to start over, that this is where she can make her stand. And it's kind of ironic because the reason why she wants to do this, she's kind of been inspired by this heist she heard about on Aldhani, that she sees that there are people who are heroic enough to stand up to the Empire, and she wants to be one of them in her own small way. Problem for Cassian is he, of course, knows the truth. He was there on Aldhani. He knows that not everybody was there for some kind of cause. They're not all, heroes, essentially. And so he still wants to convince her, but he doesn't want to tell her at the same time that he was there. I don't think he wants to burst her bubble, essentially. And so she decides to stay. Cassian tells her he's going to be worried about her. And then we have this really nice moment where Madra just smiles and says that's just what love is. It's, missing people you care about. It's worrying about people that you have to let go, essentially. And I do kind of like that Madra decides to stay because I think there is a desire for people, especially in their later years, for their life to mean something. She's probably looking back at her life. She talks about how Clem was hung in the town square and that she avoided that for years. But after this, act of heroism out of these rebels on Aldhani, she was able to put on her best coat and go to the town square for the first time in a long time. And so I think there's just this desire for her life to mean something. I think we all, again, have this desire for our life to mean something. And in this case, I think she wants to stand up for Clem. She wants Clem's life to have meant something instead of him to have just died and been hung in the town square for no reason. Either way, Madra then tells Cassian to stop looking for his sister, that she is dead and gone, that she was killed on Kenari with everybody else. And so it seems like Cassian is still conflicted about that. It's hard to know if he is actually going to eventually meet up with this sister of his, or if she truly is just dead. We're then back on Coruscant, where with the ISB again, another big meeting of theirs, where we see Lieutenant Blevin, who's kind of been the rival of Dedra. He wants to see her essentially brought up on charges for overstepping her jurisdiction. We then have Dedra respond by saying that the rebels don't care about jurisdiction, they don't care about lines on a map, they're going to do what they do no matter whose sector it is or whose sector it crosses into. Blevin then tries to point out to the Major that this was your idea to have these sectors, and she is now kind of spitting in the face of your idea. But the Major ultimately takes her side and kind of says if we all had this kind of intuition, if we all had this kind of initiative, maybe we wouldn't have been in this problem in the first place. Not that he even truly believes in the organized rebellion just yet, but he now seems to be willing to at least look at Deidre's evidence for it, since she has boldly stood up and said, I have the evidence now. Again, this is really showing the flaws of the Empire, that they are all out for themselves and not actually for the cause. They're more worried about what they can gain from being in the Empire or what they can kind of carve out for themselves rather than what the Empire is trying to accomplish. We then move on to Cassian on the planet Neomos, which seems to be some sort of resort planet, a very nice looking planet that the Empire is of course present on as well. He seems to be going by the name Keef. He has found himself a nice lady friend to spend an evening with at least. And while on his way to the store to pick up some stuff, essentially, he sees a few people running, and they're running from shore troopers. He tries not to act any differently. He just goes and does what he's doing. He gets to the store and gets stopped by one of these shore troopers who says he looks suspicious, that he's sweating. Cassian tries to point out, hey, it's a hot planet. Of course I'm sweating. But of course it doesn't matter. The shore trooper has made up his mind that Cassian must be a part of it. He calls a security droid that looks just like K2SO, another kind of one of these enforcer droids. We have this kind of funny, I guess, scene where the shore trooper tells him to hang on to this guy while he goes somewhere else. And the droid thinks he means hang as in hang Cassian, as in hang and kill him. And so we have Cassian trying to argue with the droid. Again, it's kind of a moment of levity, I guess, even though it's terrifying because Cassian looks like he's about to be killed, even though we know he can't be. We then move on to Cassian's trial. His sentencing. He doesn't get a trial. He has essentially been accused, and judgment has been passed that he must be guilty. And he gets sentenced to 6 years for essentially nothing. The episode then ends with Cyril sitting in one of these cubicles in this giant sea of cubicles, clearly quite unhappy about his current situation. And again, I think he will end up going full Imperial here in the near future. And so to wrap it up, this is an episode kind of full of irony in a way. We are seeing that the Empire wants to respond to this act of rebellion, this one single act of rebellion, which is a pretty big act, don't get me wrong. They want to completely tighten their grip and take away all freedoms, which in an odd sort of way, or ironically, is exactly what the rebellion needs them to do. They need them to make things worse in order to spark the rebellion further, in order to make more people stand up. And one of those people we see that now wants to stand up is Cassian's mother. And the irony there is, of course, that Cassian was the one who is responsible for that heist, or partially, in large part, responsible for the heist. And yet he wasn't trying to be heroic. He was completely out for himself. And yet he has now sparked the rebellion in her mother to stand up and, well, we don't know what's going to happen to her, but I'm going to guess it's not going to be a happy ending for Madra. We also see the sort of irony in Mon Mothma situation. She wants to do what is right. She knows deep down it is going to require some pretty drastic measures and that suffering will come because of them. Yet she doesn't want to fully commit or acknowledge that she's ready to fully commit. We, of course, know eventually she is going to lead the rebellion when it becomes the Rebel Alliance. So we know she is going to go down that path eventually. It's just a matter of how much it is going to cost her in terms of this relationship, if it can be called that, with her husband, not to mention her daughter. So again, another really good, well-written, well-thought-out episode that maybe didn't have a lot of action and maybe won't appeal to that person who wants a lot of action out of Star Wars, which again, I totally understand. But I am digging the intrigue. I am enjoying the character development. I am enjoying the more cerebral approach to Star Wars, that this is not something you just watch and enjoy because there are cool explosions on the screen, but it is something you have to think about. It is something you have to dig a little deeper into. It is something that is setting up the main conflict of Star Wars, right? Or one of the main ones. It's setting up this battle of rebellion versus empire. It's showing us why it needs to be fought in the first place. And so that eventual victory will be all the sweeter for the rebellion. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought of this episode. Did you enjoy it? Did you find it too slow? Are you getting even more into the series, or are you losing interest? Whatever the case may be, leave your comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.